all of you is, who likes to be told what to do? Who likes to be told and not have it negotiable? That's what you just saw. Non-negotiable. Everybody with this color skin. The other thing I wanted to say is, there were no alternative facts in this. And there were no fake news in this. And the guys that volunteered from the camps to go through the service didn't hesitate. They didn't have bone spurs. Okay? So anyway, just want you to know that today's information, today is a very critical time. And that there are a lot of similarities to what happened then and what's happening today. Because our constitutional rights are being checked. And we all have the power to not let the Constitution be violated. I just want you to know where I'm coming from.
So often I get questions, how did the film come about? And it came about because my friend, who was Yukio and I were having coffee one day. And at that time,
Marlene, can I get you to pause for a second? Because I think we just need the mic for this.
okay.
Just put it up there and speak.
Do I speak in here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was saying my friend and I were having coffee one day, and during that time, the 442nd, the All Japanese American Army unit, the most decorated unit in the military history, was being recognized, and they were being recognized by giving the Congressional Medal of Honor. And we said to ourselves, well, that's great, but what about the women? Because our mothers, raised children and gave birth at camp. So our original focus was on looking at the women's lives. And then as we started to do our interviews, you saw my mother in camp, and she was quite alert, but she was the exception. So then as we began to look for more women of that generation, they were really sickly or not able to express themselves. And our director, Joe Fox, when we began to interview the next generation, my generation, he was surprised to find out that I didn't know about camp. I heard my parents talk about camp when I was younger, but I thought it was a summer camp because they kept it light and funny. And it wasn't until high school when I learned that they were actually in prison, when my brother came home one day from school and he said, "Did you know that our parents were really in prison?" And it was a shock to me to learn, to discover that. So our director began to think about, and we both came up with looking at the long-term impact, the emotional impact on this experience on the generations, and how it's in some sense shaped identities. But I think that the film has taken on a life of its own because it decided to come into being at a time when it's most critical in our nation to begin looking at our past history, the violation of civil rights during that time, the suspension of our constitutional rights, because 2/3 of Japanese Americans were American citizens at the time, and to be uprooted, it's very, the kind of wartime hysteria and racism prevalent then is not dissimilar as to what's happening now. So I think our film is timely, and it serves as a reminder and a vehicle for opening up lines of communication. So we're open to any questions that you might have.
participants in the film?
There are a number of organizations, the Japanese American Citizens League, a lot of different historical societies, and we did a lot of outreach, and we filmed and interviewed a large number of people, and we narrowed it down to those that were most articulate and were able to really express themselves on film. So, because we started in 2012, so it took about 4.5 years to actually, have it get to this point. And also, it took time to get additional funding for it. Yes?
No country really likes talking about their dark histories. Have you faced any impediments with, apart from like just making the movie, showing it, like universities like ours, have they said, yeah, we don't want to do that, or just problems from our authorities that don't want this out there?
We haven't found that so far, but a lot of our screenings so far have been within the Japanese American community. So it's, we haven't encountered that so far.
It's been a little while since I've been in high school, and I was wondering, how much further have we come in teaching this in middle school and high school to the kids? How much farther in the past 10 years have we come? Because I'll be honest, when I was in high school, I barely even knew the topic, and I only just started to learn about it within the past probably 5 years or so, and that might just be me, being
No, I don't think it's you. I think it's a lot. It's
It's paragraph by paragraph. That's how slow it's been, and it's just people like film, producing films like this and making presentations is helping because it's part of history, and when people hear about it, then they feel self-conscious about it. And what I say is that although it happened to the Japanese, you got to look at the genocide of the indigenous people, and then you have to look at the slaves that came over, and all the other civil rights that were violated. And so this is the part of the whole scene, but the emphasis tonight is strictly what happened to the Japanese American. My brother was graduated high school in the camp, and he went to Ypsilanti, Michigan on a scholarship provided by a church. He wasn't there one semester before he got drafted. So our family was in the camp, he gets drafted, and he goes into basic training, and so that's the irony of the whole situation. Now the other one is, we had funerals in the camp of the soldiers that fought in the Second World War. So we had Gold Star mothers and fathers inside the camp. So you think about that, and then you think, wow, this is really ironic.
I just wanted to really quickly speak to that. I'm the education director at the Historical Museum, and I've been there for 4 years. And I can say that each year there are more teachers that actively pursue field trips for their kids or have us come do presentations. And obviously Missoula, we have a site, so it's an easier connection. And it is really on a teacher-by-teacher basis. I wouldn't say that it's explicitly in the curriculum at this point, other than there's a section about World War II, so in some grades they can talk about it. Oh, and are you a teacher? Or you
I teach U.S. history at Sentinel High School here in Missoula, and I would say, I would mirror what you were saying. It is definitely a kind of a teacher-by-teacher basis in regards to whether they want to address these issues or not. Textbooks, you're gonna be, it's tough sleigh to find this kind of actually in the textbook of even the textbooks that we have today. Just in kind of like what Yukio was saying in regards to this, there's so many different atrocities in regards to this same topic, I guess, depending on the the ethnicity of the person as well. And so they have so many different categories to cover in the textbooks. But ultimately, it is taught if teachers want to teach it, I guess.
One more point. The connection that I have with the Fort Missoula is that my father-in-law was incarcerated there, and he was interrogated cruelly. And it was because he was Japanese. He had been he got drafted when he was 18, discharged when he was 20, and here he was 30 years old by then. And the interesting thing is, he changed his last name to accept the wife's name because the wife, my mother-in-law, was the oldest daughter of 4 daughters, and their last names would have gone away if he didn't change his name to hers. So my question to all of you guys is, are you willing to change your last name to accept your wife's name so that then the last name can carry on in the legacy? So just a rhetorical question.
Seems like
I wanted to chime in quick. I am a student at Sentinel High School, and we did learn about like Japanese internment and stuff, and my father and I and our family have been to other internment camps like in Idaho and stuff like that. But I think that throughout middle school and high school, it kind of gets not really ignored, but overshadowed by more colossal events such as the Holocaust or, I don't know, German occupation of Europe.
No doubt, no doubt.
So, I think it's there that the problem is that it's, you got 1 year
There's a
to
lot to cover,
do
yeah.
all of history.
It was a war crime within a war filled with war crimes.
Right.
Yeah.
I had some questions about the pilgrimage. So there's just the one to Manzanar, is that right?
And there's one at Hard Mountain and at other camps also.
Tule Lake,
I was gonna say too,
Topaz.
because I was thinking about, if I'm understanding this right, Tule Lake may have even had more internees at its height than Manzanar. And I was just kind of thinking about
Well,
how.
Tule Lake was originally a internment camp, and then they switched over to have it for the hardcore.
Yeah.
Those that were not, that, they had to, how do you want to talk about the loyalty question?
There was
Loyalty
a
questionnaire.
there was a questionnaire that was passed around in the camps. And the questionnaire included a comment about, is your loyalty to the United States or to Japan? If it's to Japan, then that's no. And then, will you fight for the United States? And if you said no, then you went to Tule Lake, where all the no-nos went.
Yeah, not the yes.
And that's the hardcore people who thought they were gonna go back to Japan during the war and trade with the Americans that got captured in Japan and in the East. So there's just all kinds of stuff that you shake your head at.
Yeah. Well, the last part I wanted to find out about was, in these pilgrimages, is there, I don't know, any specificity to what people expect to get out, or is it a very individualized experience?
It's here. It's all
Very
here.
much a person by person, what?
Yep, it's all here. It's a memory. It's embedded. And you can't get away from it. And so I have it. My children sort of have it, but their children have less of it unless they get into the heart of what it's all about. So this is where, we try to pass it on, but then on the other hand, you got your telephones and they can't get their eyes off their telephones, so they can't be bothered with current affairs and all that stuff.
Thanks.
To speak on pilgrimages, I work over at the Historical Museum, and I've been to two. I've been to Heart Mountain, and just this past summer I went to Amache's. And Heart Mountains was an all-camp pilgrimage, so people came from all the different camps, where Amache's was mainly just people who were interned there. And I went in as a complete outsider. You know, I'm not Japanese. I have no connection other than the place that I work. And you know, Fort Missoula doesn't have pilgrimages. We don't have anybody alive anymore that we can do something like that. So the feeling that this movie gives you, that family, that place, that sense of place, that's what you get from a pilgrimage. You know, it reminds me of your film. You know you're in a bad place. You know these people experienced bad things, but they talk about the football games and the basketball games and being a Boy Scout and going to high school and having dances. And it's amazing to be in this bad place and hear these good stories and that balance and recognizing that life happened here by being surrounded by these people is like no other experience I've ever had. So I'm very thankful for people like Marlene and Yukio who are willing to tell their stories and to go to these camps, to accept people like me coming in and being willing to, you know, share this little bit of their family's life. So I recommend going to a pilgrimage if you can, and going to these camps. There are always people at these places that are willing to talk to you and tour you around.
Go to Fort Missoula.
Yeah, or come back.
I asked my mother what her feelings were about going to camp, and her response was, that's it. That's the way she emoted and just went like that. In other words, no comment, because it was so painful.
For my parents never went back to Poston. They never went to a reunion or a pilgrimage, mainly because I think my father, for him it was too painful, because in Poston, Camp 1, he was the chief of police for a while. And during that time they had a strike, and it took me a long time to do a lot of research. And I think that it was really, really difficult for him in that role. And it was so painful that he never wanted to go back. And so my parents never went back to Poston. They never saw it after they left.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. You mentioned that maybe this film was kind of a process of growth. Could you speak a little bit more about like that journey and how it affected you and maybe the other participants?
Yeah, well, beyond, a tribute to my parents, it was a process of sorting things out personally in terms of my own identity, kind of some of the cultural conflicts I experienced in growing up, trying to be the all-American kid, and yet having this, knowing that basically I'm Japanese, but I didn't know quite what that meant, and kind of sorting through things. And when I was doing diversity management consulting, I often tell a story about trying to come to terms with my background and understanding. And when I was 5 or 6, my parents, I grew up in an area, Anaheim, where in my class there were 1,200 people, 1,200 students, and they were mostly Caucasian. There were like probably 3 Asian families. And so my parents all of our friends, we belonged to the Christian church, we were in the Y, all of our friends in the community were Caucasian. But we had other friends and relatives in Los Angeles, and once in a while we would have our Japanese friends over, and it would be something different. So my mother would cook Japanese food, and I remember sitting around the table, and my parents would ask our guests if they would want more rice. And they would say, oh no, that's okay. And then there would be more conversation, and again, then my parents would say, would you like more rice? And they'd say, no, it's fine. And then the third time they asked, they would say, okay, maybe we'll have some. And what they were doing was displaying what they call enjo, where you show your modesty. You don't say yes the first time, even though you want it. And they had this whole ritual where you know, it's part of etiquette, being proper. So I was like 5 or 6. So I went to a birthday party, and they asked me if I wanted more birthday cake. And I said no when I meant yes. And then so they said, okay, there was no second, third time around. So I quickly learned, I began to, you know, begin understanding these cultural differences. So yeah, it's a process of kind of peeling back the onion, going through the different layers, kind of feeling this sense of shame but not knowing why, some situations in where you feel your parents' pain but not understanding why. And so it took a long time to kind of process everything. You can begin to understand. And also, you know, leaving a small community that was pretty much all Caucasian and going out and after leaving, kind of doing all things Asian, you know, because Asian studies was big at the time, so just growing more, I should say.
Going off of your answer to that question, in the video it said that there was a loss of heritage. Do you feel that you have a loss of heritage? Like I know you just described like.
Not anymore, because I feel I worked hard, and, you know, when it was okay, then I would ask my mother a lot of questions, my parents a lot of questions, and join more Japanese American groups. So no, I think, so I kind of went the other way.
Do you wish there was more as you were growing up?
Pardon me?
Do you wish there was more? Like you wish that like your parents had been more like
When you were growing up.
Well, yeah, the only thing I think I wish I would have learned was the Japanese language. But, you know, we were, my mother was too busy. We had piano lessons, 4-H, Christian church, everything, so, you know, to be part of the mainstream. And I would say it was just a very satisfying life, and looking back.
I was thinking this might be a good time to just move up to the lounge. I have cookies, if anybody wants cookies. We can continue